So, going off of, actually, I would like to start with Happy Veterans Day. Thank you to all who served. Actually, we had a dedication this morning for a new Veterans Memorial on campus. So, I was tempted to do that because I did spend some time living in Hawaii, and one of the houses I lived in was right off of Pearl Harbor. So, if I would have had time, I would have loved to give that justice given the day, but didn't quite. So I figured I'd go with what I knew. And since we talked about we'd had our walkathon previously, so I figured we could talk about exercise and go through some of the activity recommendations and try to show everybody how accessible it can be. All right. So just as an introduction, right, we've come a long ways in terms of our culture, our work settings. And so we have, this much more this smaller need for human movement, right? We don't have to walk to school uphill both ways. We're not working in an industrial setting. And most of us, go and sit down all day to work and then come home and sit down all day. So that lower level of movement means that we're not spending as many calories. And that means we have that reduction in how much we move around per day. And that means we also have more people that are either telecommuting or getting in their car and commuting. And that means that along with less jobs requiring activity means we're not being as active. So when we look at how many people don't get the recommended amount of exercise, we see about 45 to 75% people report that they're physically inactive. They're not meeting the guidelines.
Okay.
If we look at data with accelerometers, so basically using your phone or your watch to track how much people are moving, right? We're seeing a lot of young children are inactive. We see adolescents inactive, and most adults over the age of 20 aren't meeting those guidelines. I will freely admit I am one of them some weeks. Right? So the American College of Sports Medicine is one of their taglines for the past several years has been exercise is medicine. We can treat a lot of some of the conditions that come up with exercise, right? Changes in activity and trying to get people moving. So stakeholders with that, right? Healthcare providers, right? If we can get I'm sure some of you have had your doctor tell you that you needed to move more or do something to help with blood pressure, et cetera, right? Exercise professionals, community stakeholders. And so if we're not moving as much, what we do see is this increase in overall mortality, right? So about a 49% increase in all-cause mortality, as well as with disease risk, especially cardiovascular disease. So we see that with every 2-hour increase in screen time per day, we do see an increase in cardiovascular disease risk of about 17%. So I don't know about you, but that's really disturbing things to hear while we're sitting here staring at a screen. So I will try to keep this under 2 hours. So with that sedentary behavior, we also see a lot bigger instance of people eating more calories than they're burning. And if we're eating more calories than we're burning, that means we're storing it and we're getting a little bit squishier. Right? We also see changes in blood glucose, and that's meaning increases in blood sugars, and that can lead to conditions like diabetes or metabolic disease. And the more sedentary you are, again, increased risk of certain types of cancers, decreased bone mass, and that's important for reducing fracture risk, as well as decreased ability to be functional and independent, especially as you age. All right, and our other part that ties into this is kind of this obesity epidemic we have. So we have 23 states that have obesity rates above 35%, and about 1 in 5 adults qualifying as obese, given that's using BMI, but that's still not the best numbers. And so if we follow from about 1985 and we start to look at the obesity rates as we go through the 80s and the 90s, you see this general trend of it starting to increase and increase. And Colorado finally gives up the ghost of being under 20% in 2010. And then we keep going. And the good news is the last year of data, Colorado actually did decrease a little bit. They dropped back under that 25%. But as we can see, that's not a good trend overall.
Wow,
So
That Midwest. Woo.
It's the one I usually point out is Louisiana and Mississippi do some bad things, and then in terms of leading the trend, occasionally West Virginia.
Yeah.
But what do you know? When it's cold half the year and you don't want to go outside, um, so ideally, what we want to do is not only do we want to be more active, we want to reduce this sedentary behavior, all this sitting we do. And that can be something that maybe you're not changing your overall activity, but we can still reduce that sedentary behavior. And that's kind of one of the things you can see is somebody who may actually get enough physical activity, they're still at an increased risk if they're not being active throughout the day. So if you go out and I would definitely do this some days last month where I would go and I would get my walk, but then the rest of the day I'm often would spend sitting in my office, especially because we're doing registration. So I have meeting after meeting after meeting.
Mhm.
And so I'm really not active throughout the day, other than the fact that I would get up and move from classroom to classroom, but I'm spending most of my day in one place. So ideally we want to do something to reduce that, and sometimes it's just smaller choices, right? And parking at the other end of the parking lot, taking the stairs, right? Getting up and taking breaks, especially mental breaks, because let's be honest, we can't sit and focus for multiple hours at a time. That's not how human brains work. So taking a break and walking around the office real quick to kind of reset or think about something before you sit back down and continue. So when we're talking about trying to generate this movement, right, we see kind of different areas. We see physical activity is basically anything you're doing outside of laying down. So the moment you roll over in bed, that is technically physical activity, right? Hopefully there's more than that. Now, if I'm doing physical activity for the point of improving fitness, that would be exercise. If I have a competitive aspect, that would be sport. But that will lead to, right, physical fitness, which is kind of our overall term for talking about the attributes that lead to how well we can perform physical activity. So those break down, right? We have cardiovascular endurance, which is mostly what we worked on with all that walking, the ability of our heart and our lungs to move oxygen in from the environment and get it to our muscles and all the other working components of the body, as well as sending nutrients around. Right? Muscular strength, how much force you're able to generate. A lot of times, one of the easy ways we can test this is just looking at hand grip strength. Correlates really well with like overall strength. Muscular endurance, if you've ever had to do a plank or do quarter eagles and sit against a wall and see how long you could do it, right? That would be muscular endurance. Flexibility. I'm sure we've all had that try to touch your toes moment. And then the last one is body composition. So it's not necessarily as something you're able to do as much as how much of you is squishy versus how much is not squishy. And that's something we often want to change as we look at changing physical activity. So that physical activity we can kind of break down into 4 areas. We have all the recreational stuff we do, exercise and sport, but also all the stuff where you don't really have a choice depending on where you're at, right? Part of that's going for that physical activity, it's transportation, right? You have to get from one place to another. How often are you getting up and moving around, right? If we look at your occupation, right? Obviously, my mailman probably gets a lot more steps per day in than I do. And then anything you're doing around the household, if you're having to clean and do stuff like that, right? Dishes or cooking, all is physical activity. So when we talk about that sedentary behavior, that's when we're doing what we're doing right now. We're sitting and we're engaging in less than 1.5 metabolic equivalents, which is just the energy you burn at rest. So if you're just sitting here quietly and not fidgeting while you're watching me, that's about 1 met. So that's kind of the standard energy rate that we'll talk about for some things. And that gives us an easy way to predict how hard you're working that we can scale between people. And so physical inactivity is not meeting our activity guidelines. So ideally, depending on the intensity of exercise we're doing, we want to get at least a half hour a day of moderate intensity activity, 5 days a week. Or if we're exercising more intensely, we don't have to exercise as much, and we see only 20 minutes of vigorous intensity 3 days per week, or some combination thereof. So where does that come from? That comes from ACSM and CDC and American Heart Association. And part of that's coming from the Healthy People Initiative. So what that is that's a data-driven set where we're looking at about 350 or so objectives to measure just the health of the U.S. population. 27 of those deal with physical activity, and one of their things that they had up is that, again, 1 in 4 adults and 1 in 5 adolescents in the US don't meet those physical activity guidelines for aerobic and muscle strengthening activities. So ideally what we're shooting for is, again, at least 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity or 75 minutes per week of vigorous. All right, and that's going to get us some benefit, but when it comes to exercise, some is good, more is usually better. What we call a dose dependent response. If you exercise more, you will tend to get more benefit than if you were exercising less, right? Especially if you're starting from couch potato. So, and ideally, along with that, we get about two or more days of muscle strengthening per week. All right, kind of the same thing. And what we see is if we get past that minimum, that 150 minutes and 75 minutes, is we see further improvements in fitness or further reduction of risk of chronic disease, or it helps prevent some of that unhealthy weight gain, especially because we're coming up against the time of year where I tend to put on weight with Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's.
Yep.
All right. So with that, the other thing that happens is a lot of times, if we look at the national data, there's also some disparities in the amount that we're getting depending on your sex, ethnicity, age, education, family type, country of birth, disability status, geographic location, whether or not you have health insurance, which I'm sure goes back to family income, your marital status, all of that plays a role. And if you really want to break down how those affect things, that's kind of the last slide. If you really want to see it, we can talk about it. But how do we figure out what intensity we're working at, right? I've been talking about moderate and vigorous intensity, and okay, what's that? So one of the ways you can do it is we can look at your heart rate, right? And everybody's, I'm sure, has done that at some point, is find that carotid pulse and count, right? Or you've got a watch that will do it for you now, right? Or several other ways to measure it. But if we're doing that, it works pretty well. There's a slightly different version than just using like the percentage of your max heart rate, because you really don't use a lot of your heart rate range, right? So if we think of your max heart rate as fast as your heart can go, and the resting heart rate or your heart rate overnight being as low as it'll go, it really doesn't go below that. So there's all this area we're not using because it really shouldn't get down to zero, right? It will at one point, but hopefully not for a while. So how we figure out the amount you're working above resting but below your max is what we call heart rate reserve. So if I take my max heart rate, and that could be age predicted max, right? If we just use 220 minus your age, works pretty good as long as you get, as long as you're past about 30 or 40. We take that max, and then we're going to subtract your resting heart rate, and that gets us this range here that you really work in. And we call that heart rate reserve. So if I'm trying to figure out what intensity I want to work at, well, if we're working in, let's say we want to work in vigorous intensity, I'm going to be at the low end of that. We'll do 60%. So I'm going to take that percentage and plug it in, multiply it by how big this area is. And then there's the important step that my students always forget, is adding back in this space, the resting heart rate. Because if I just do the percentage of this, right, it's really only there to there. And so it tells me that my workout's supposed to be like 70 beats per minute when my resting is 90. That doesn't work. So that's one way to do it if you have access to looking at your heart rate. Well, darn, I don't have that. Right? So the other way is just simply how well you can talk. So if we look at what's called the talk test, I'm sure we've all been there, right? If you can doing that light exercise, and I can sit there and talk to people and discuss things, and then we increase the intensity or we hit a hill, and all of a sudden I'm starting to have to talk like this, right? And we're having to break up those sentences to try to make sure I get that next breath in so that I don't miss out. And I'm sure Matt was there last week with the COVID issues,
Yeah.
right? And all of a sudden that getting up and going to the bathroom was vigorous intensity. So that's our easy way to do it, is that kind of, if we're around that point, if we're below that point where I can still hold a conversation, that's going to be kind of light to moderate. If I'm at that point where I'm having to start to interrupt my talking to make sure I can get that next breath, that's going to be vigorous intensity. So that's one way to do it. Another way is what we call ratings of perceived exertion. How hard do you think you're working? And we can do that on two different scales. We can do that on a 0 to 10 scale, where it's just, okay, 0 is nothing and 10 is, oh boy, make it stop, right? Or there's another scale that gets used more for exercise professionals or for like cardiac stress tests, is what we call the Borg scale, that goes from 6 to 20. And that's because 6, if we multiply that by 10, right? 60, your resting heart rate. And then 20, if we multiply that by 10, we get 200, which is close to your max heart rate. So just a different way of doing things. So again, that moderate intensity, only about a 3 to 4 on that 10-point scale, or about a 12 to 13 on that Borg scale. Vigorous, we're going to move that up to a 5 to 7, right? Which still means we have 8, 9, and 10 for that maximal exercise, right? Or 14 to 17. Usually if I'm doing a VO2 max test for my students, I want them to hit at least a 17 on that ratings of perceived exertion, because I want, I'm trying to break them with the treadmill a la Rocky 4, right? The treadmill will go the same speed, and it just keeps getting steeper and steeper and steeper until they say no mas. So going back to those METs we talked about, right? Again, we're talking about moderate and vigorous. Well, moderate, again, I can maintain that conversation uninterrupted, and that's going to be, things like walking at 3.5 to 4.5 miles an hour, 3 to 4.5 miles per hour. So, 20-minute mile, about a 4.5 is probably going to be about a 13-minute mile, 12.5-minute mile, right? Vacuuming, mowing your lawn. While vigorous, right, we're usually having to change that, right? Walking at 5 miles per hour is a pretty quick mile. You're booking it, right? Or jogging or cycling, right? More than 10 miles per hour, or going uphill, that sort of thing, right? But we have that increase with moderate, but we're still able to talk. And then vigorous, we're having to break up the talking. And as you start to look into these more and more, you start to see there are some very impressive lists to give you an idea of what you were doing. So this is just the small one, right? And then we get into vigorous. And then if you really want to go into the weeds, there's an annual publication called the Compendium of Physical Activities that gives the Met equivalents for it. Has one separate document for adults, older adults, individuals in wheelchairs, and it gives about 22 major headings to break things down, from bicycling to video games. Right? It has 92 different variations on walking, including 2 on the Ministry of Funny Walks, a la Monty Python. So I can't, if I remember the last time I looked at like dancing, there's about 50 different types of dancing in there. So if you really want to figure out how hard you're working for some of the stuff you're doing, there you go. So how we can figure this out, right? This is kind of putting everything into one place. We can talk about heart rate reserve. We can talk about VO2 max, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that. That's more of our gold standard for that fitness level, right? Percent of heart rate max, right? We have our METs, or 1 repetition maximum we'll talk about when we get to resistance training here in a second. So if we're trying to figure out how much we're getting, right? So we can use that moderate or vigorous and figure out how much you're getting per day and try to figure out what you're doing, right? Again, some is good, more is better. So if you're up and fairly active throughout the day, right? Awesome. If even better, if we can get exercise throughout the day and try to reduce that sedentary time. So even if I say, hey, 30 minutes a day, that doesn't have to be 30 minutes all in one go. That can be 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, or like 20 and 10. As long as you're getting about 10 minutes in one go, you're doing pretty good. But you don't have to, I need to do 60 minutes today. We can break that up, right? That can be 20-minute walk in the morning, 20 minutes at lunch, 20 minutes after dinner, right? Not to mention that'll help move things around with digestion and all that. So we've spent all this time talking about aerobic, and now we're going to spend some time talking about resistance training. So after you get past about 30, if you're not doing anything, your muscles are going to get smaller. It's called a process called sarcopenia, or muscle loss. So we're going to see your muscle mass decrease about 3 to 8% per decade if you're not doing anything. So resistance training has been shown it helps improve physical performance. It helps control your movement control, helps increase your walking speed. As you age, it can help you be more functionally independent. It can also help with cognition, right? As well as, due to our culture, right, helps with self-esteem. If I'm able to do more things, right, that can help with self-esteem, that sense of independence, as well as it will also help with metabolism. So burning off that Thanksgiving meal, right, gets a lot easier if you have more muscle mass, because most of the energy you're burning throughout the day is not coming from necessarily the movement you're doing, the physical activity. It's coming from your body essentially paying rent, maintaining your body, what we call basal metabolic rate. So if you're trying to hit those just 2 to 3 days a week for resistance training, we can do a whole body circuit. So we're going to work on all the muscles at once and work our way through. Right, so probably about 6 to 8 exercises or so, depending on the exercises you choose. Right, and again, we don't necessarily have to go to a gym. There's a lot you can do with just body weight, or with simple bands, or even you get the gallon of milk out of the fridge. That's an 8-pound weight. We can still make that work for you. So if you're just starting out and you haven't been doing any resistance training, right, we can do 1 set of reps. Right, so one set, one time around the circuit. So again, that's 6 to 8 exercises, 8 to 12 reps each, right? And you actually will see improvement, right, if you're not doing anything. Now, obviously, as we do more, you're going to have to do more sets as you get more training and adjust, because your body's annoying like that. If you keep doing the same thing, it will only adjust as much as it needs to. It's much like my students. If I ask them to do something, they're very good at figuring out what the bare minimum is and doing that. So hit the wheel. So if you're an older individual, we're going to reduce that a little bit. We're going to make it a little bit lighter, bump it up to about 10 to 15 reps per set. And then kind of as you get to the point where, okay, I can do 1 or 2 reps past that endpoint, then okay, we probably need to bump up the weight a little bit. And after we bumped it up a little bit, okay, after a couple weeks, now we can start to, let's work a second set in and go 2 times around the circuit instead of just once. But if we do that and we're doing a minute of rest in between exercises and we're doing 8 sets or 8 exercises, right, that's maybe 15 minutes. Right. And of course, me saying this, I also go with, I don't have time to go do this. Honestly, resistance training is probably going to be more time effective in terms of burning calories than actually going and doing aerobic exercise. And in terms of some of the benefits, can have just as much, if not more, because we're also starting to build that muscle mass. All right. So back to the doom and gloom. So benefits of physical activity, right? Along with obviously reducing the prevalence of disease, mortality, morbidity of many leading causes of death, right? If we think about cardiovascular disease, other issues, blood pressure, things like that, we see there's a relationship between physical activity and reductions of all-cause mortality with things like the Harvard Alumni Health Study or the Framingham Heart Study, where they've been tracking that for years and years and years. Right? We also see that reduction of chronic disease with increases in physical activity. So we see, right, that physical activity, cardiovascular disease, right, stroke, right, certain types of cancer, surprisingly, right, lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, pancreatic cancer, all have been shown to have a reduction or a benefit for individuals with those conditions. right? Diabetes, the more active you are. So with type 2 diabetes, right, that's where your body does not respond to insulin. What insulin is that hormone that helps get blood sugar from the blood and get it absorbed into your cells. And so if you have too high of a blood sugar and thus insulin for too long, your body stops responding to it. Well, exercise activates that same transporter to let blood sugar into your cells. So we can help control diabetes with, right, obviously diet. We need to reduce the sugar intake, but also exercise. Right? Getting you more active helps with that glycemic control, keeping your blood sugar steady, as well as that action of insulin, and that can help with blood glucose. It also helps with controlling blood pressure, right? Controlling your lipids, your cholesterol, as well as weight loss, maintaining weight loss. So generally we see with more physical activity, right? Weight loss or preventing weight gain is really not what we're not worried. What we're worried about. It's been the end of the day. All right, sorry. What we're worried about is not necessarily your weight, it's your body composition. And if we look at fat versus muscle, muscle is about 5 times more dense than fat. So even if I don't lose weight on the scale, I may have gained a little bit of muscle and I've lost some fat, right? Especially if we do reduction in calories, right? We want to have a little bit extra, less calories than we normally do, right? We're shooting for about a pound or 2 pounds of weight loss per week to keep things sustainable. If we try to crash diet, usually you're just going to bounce right back because your body goes into, this dude doesn't know how to hunt. And the moment you give it extra calories, it's going to put them back in storage. Right. And then again, physical activity will help you be more independent as you age. So in summary, sedentary time is associated with negative health outcomes, right? Even if you do meet your physical activity guidelines. However, most of us don't meet the guidelines. But even if you're not meeting them, we want to work in that direction, right? Some activity is better than none, but more is generally better, right? That being said, do not try to go out and run a marathon tomorrow. It won't end well, especially the day after that, right? And then physical activity can help reduce the incidence or the progression of several diseases and help improve quality of life. However, and here's my caveat to CYA, is those with any diagnosed or symptoms of cardiovascular, metabolic, kidney diseases need to consult a doctor before starting an exercise program. That being said, we do try to remove as many barriers as we can. So as long as you're not symptomatic or have been diagnosed, you can start exercising, then we just need to progress you slowly. All right, and at this point, any questions?
Well, I think it's a fantastic presentation.
Yeah, especially doing it on very short notice. Thank you so much.
It's like I get paid to do that for a living.
I had a question for you. Obviously, I think, can't you lower your MET or change it?
So what do you mean by, so the METs is the intensity level.
The metabolic equivalence?
Yeah. So are you looking more for talking about like how many calories you burn?
Yeah.
So that will change a little bit, ideally, and this is where like the resistance training can really be helpful. Is it costs more to, as I usually tell my students, to rent muscle than it does fat. Fat isn't very active. It just kind of sits there. Muscle you need to work to maintain. And so, if I can get out of I don't want to share. There we go. Stop sharing. There we go. So muscle costs more to maintain. So the more muscle you have, the more calories you're going to burn per day, just keeping that up. Right? It's kind of like the thermostat in your house. If you turn it up, your electricity bill takes off.
Right.
So if I'm burning more calories for upkeep, that means you're going to be burning more per day, even if you're just sitting there. So part of what happens is as you age and some of that muscle goes away, then the amount of calories you're burning per day is going to go down.
There you go.
And so that's why getting that resistance training to try to keep that muscle mass or even maybe put a little on will be very effective for you in terms of helping with body composition.
Okay. The other terminology that you had in there that I didn't see a definition for was activity thermogenesis.
So that's how many calories you're burning through activity.
Oh,
So if we think about how many calories you burn a day as a pie chart, about 2/3 of it is going to be rent. A little less than a third is going to be moving you around throughout the day. And then the rest is going to be, that little sliver is going to be what we call like food induced thermogenesis, or the thermic effect of food.
oh, okay.
Which is basically, in order to eat food, right, I have to pick it up, I have to chew it, and I have to spend calories to break it down so I can absorb it. So when they talk about celery not having any calories, it's the fact that in order to absorb all the calories from celery, you have to burn about as many as you get.
Oh, okay.
Morgan?
Yep.
Yeah, I have a question. Yeah, because the PM 2.5 problem has become more serious than before. So you want to walk or jog, when do you think is the most suitable time for us to do?
Whatever you're used to. I mean, I'm a bigger individual. Me jogging is going to be harder on my joints. And so if I want to increase my intensity, usually what I'm going to do is go get a treadmill and increase the incline and walk uphill to where I'm not having that pounding. Because once you start jogging, that's a lot more weight going through your lower extremity that you have to absorb. And if you're already on your way to arthritis, like my knees are, post ACL, we're going to have to do that. So it's whatever you can do. I mean, a lot of it turns into what's your choice? What will you continue to do? Because who's had that? I'm going to take up jogging on a regular basis, and I don't know about most of us are not runners at heart. So me running is usually, if I've gotten to the point where I'm going to go run, I'm either very dedicated or I'm trying to work some stuff out mentally. And that's not really going to be sustainable, right? So the main thing is trying to make the choices to be active and finding what you enjoy. If we have somebody who doesn't know how to swim and I'm telling them they need to swim for their workout, they're looking for an excuse not to, right? We have a barrier in place. So we want to limit the barriers. And so we need to figure out, okay, what do they like to do? What do they like to do that's going to be active? Is it okay? We need to get them to, is it they're going to do better if I have them doing walking or a stair climber or a stationary bike? It's just finding something.
Thank you.
Okay. How about yoga?
Yoga can be great. It's a lot of body weight stuff and a lot of neuromuscular control. So you get better at using the muscles you have and more efficient. Not to mention, and if depending on which yoga class you're in, helping with just being mentally present, that sort of thing. But it's a really great set of body weight exercises. Just don't jump straight into hot yoga. And don't expect to be super flexible right off the bat. I definitely had a couple moments where I was taking yoga my senior year of undergrad where, okay, now put one elbow inside of the other. And I just kind of went, no. But my dad actually started doing yoga about a year ago, year or two ago, and he's really been taken to it. So
my brother-in-law started it, and he's like a 4th degree black belt, and he told me it's the best thing he's ever done.
Yep.
So
Can I ask what about opinion about using weight machines versus free weights? One significantly better than the other, or just really whatever works for you?
There's trade-offs for both. I mean, the nice part about weight machines is it's a lot harder to hurt yourself. So if we have somebody who's still working on some of that motor control and movement, or is still building up muscle, right? The weight machine works, right? It's still going to be, everything's nice and controlled. We don't have to worry about spending extra calories trying to just make the weight not move to move in that direction. So it's a lot safer, right? Obviously, space efficient is not its thing, right? And we're not getting some of those extra stabilizer muscles firing. So with free weight, we have to worry more about technique, and we're going to get some of those little muscles around the joint firing. But so you're probably, and there's all sorts of things when you look at like how the resistances work and the mechanical advantages. But again, it turns into what's your goal? If your goal is just to be active and you prefer doing the weight machines as opposed to the free weights, go for it. If I'm training somebody for sport, I'm going to have kind of a different set of restrictions or what I want them to be able to do. And so for that, I'm probably leaning more towards free weights.
Thanks. And one off the wall question here. What football conference is Heidelberg in these days?
We are currently in the OAC, the Ohio Athletic Conference.
Okay. That's Penny's alma mater. Yeah, right. Hillsdale is coming to Columbus to play Ohio Dominican next week, and I had no idea if you guys are in there. Used to be a thing called the GLIAC, and I thought you guys were.
The GLIAC, yeah, not us. I think we have John Carroll is currently ditching us and going D2. So, oh darn, we won't miss them all that much. If only Mount Union would get motivated and leave too.
Cool.
Julie, looks like you got a
Morgan.
question.
Yeah, I have a question for you. So, what's your opinion on the high intensity type of classes like your Orange Theory or something like that? Do you think that they're beneficial or more injury prone than anything?
So, like the high intensity interval training can be really, really useful in that we're getting a more intense workout faster. So, again, we're back to you don't have to exercise as long. And because of the high intensity, you end up actually burning more calories afterwards. So for if you've ever heard people talk about like EPOC, if like after an exercise, you're not going straight from just, okay, I've just got done working out to, okay, I'm at my resting level, right? It takes time for your body to come back down to normal.
Yeah.
With high intensity interval training, that stays up longer. So instead of going on that run and the amount of calories you burn afterwards is roughly a potato chip, it can actually last like up to a day as your body makes adjustments.
Okay, so like 5 potato chips.
A little bit more than that. Again, we're building, so a lot of with that high intensity, you tend to build more muscle.
Okay.
And so it will kind of build things up. Now, that being said, do you want to jump straight from couch into a super intense workout? No. Right? We need to work our way up to that. And that's where some of the issues are. So like that's one of the big things with CrossFit. It's like that high intensity interval training isn't bad. It's just a matter of we can't drop you into that from doing nothing.
Right.
Because just like if I try to go lift heavy weights straight off of that, or I try to go run a marathon off the couch, what's going to happen, right? I'm going to hurt myself.
Yep. Okay.
Your body needs time to adjust.
Fantastic. Okay. So, Julie had asked whether you could share that PowerPoint with us.
Yeah, not a problem. You want me to just email it to you, Matt?
Yeah, that'll do it. And then I'll just send it out on DACDB to everybody. It will be part of the meeting that's being recorded, and that will be on our website too. But if people want just the plain PowerPoint, then send it to me and I can send it on out for sure.